joining us now is Michael Lighty. Michael has kindly been on the program before. He is the Director of Public Policy for National Nurses United. He knows the healthcare world inside and out. He's been organizing for social and economic justice for many years, and I believe he shares with me the opinion that healthcare is a fundamental right, a fundamental issue of justice. And we thought we'd talk a little bit about the year that's passed and the year to come. So first of all, Michael, thanks so much for coming on the program. Do we have you?
Yes, thank you, RJ. Really appreciate it. Great to see you, and I agree with you. Healthcare is a human right and a fundamental issue of justice.
Yeah, I feel that it's the proto-human right. It's the one from which all others spring. If you don't have life, you can't enjoy any of them. So let's start there with just a quick recap, because I'm into what we're going to be doing in 2018. But let's do a quick recap of 2017 and the progress that we made on the fight for healthcare for all in this country. What are your, just briefly, how would you recap the year going past?
I would say we learned something fundamental about where folks in the U.S. are, and that is that they believe that the federal government has an obligation to ensure people get the health care they need. That we saw that because in the fight over the ACA, when the GOP and the Trump administration put health care on the table, people reacted in a way to say, no, I want to keep what I have, and I'm afraid of what you're going to take away. And the most popular program that emerged from that fight was Medicaid. So now we have a great historical test. Do Americans believe in the public provision of health care? Turns out, yes, dramatically so. And that is a huge lesson. And we also learned that we can't just play defense, because on the healthcare fight, what brought so many activists to DC and motivated them to put their bodies on the line, disabled folks in particular, was the notion that we can, not just that we're going to have the status quo, which was inadequate, but that we can actually guarantee health care as a human right. And that motivated folks beyond the defense of the ACA. So we made huge progress. And ironically, none of this would have happened if Hillary Clinton had been elected. We wouldn't have been in the same fight. Healthcare as a fundamental question would not have been on the table. Incremental reform, tweaking, yes. But what the GOP did was put healthcare on the table as a fundamental question, and our side, I think, is winning that by answering yes, we want guaranteed healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I think that crystallizes a lot of things I've been pondering in the last couple weeks as I look back on the year. And I also think, you know, we had a couple other lessons related to it, or maybe implied in what you were saying. One is that we saw in the attacks on the ACA, not just the Trump care, but the way the changes that are made in the so-called tax reform bill and so on, that we see that, you know, we were told, those of us who are fighting for universal health care, for a single-payer system, have always been told, you know, that's not so practical. This incremental approach is more pragmatic. But it actually turns out that the incremental approach is extremely fragile and easily blown away in the wind by, you know, a couple provisions in a bill passed by a single session of Congress, whereas those things that are rooted in the government provision of services, Medicare, notice that they didn't put in a paragraph destroying Medicare. They'd like to, but think about how much more tenacious, how much more hard work is going to take for them to really gut Medicare. Medicare is a flashpoint that people want to defend. As you said, Medicaid, of another flashpoint that people literally put their bodies on the line for. So isn't one of the lessons of 2017 that real reform, healthcare as a human right, government healthcare, or whatever you want to describe it as, is really more pragmatic too?
I love that. I love that, RJ, because I think that's exactly right. Healthcare, we're basically in a debate on first principles. And is healthcare a public good that should be guaranteed by the federal government as a matter of their role as protector? Because let's face it, now the federal government doesn't do it, but local jurisdictions do. They protect us against crime and fire. We never even think about insurance in that context because it's a public good and an expectation the government will provide it. That's where we're moving in healthcare, and I think the support for Medicaid showed that. And you're right, it's in direct contrast to incrementalism because it turns out that we are more insecure now than we were a year and a half ago, precisely because of how the ACA was jerry-rigged and is so dependent on those tax subsidies and the individual mandate. Once those go away, the whole program collapses, and therefore people really have a deep sense of insecurity that this isn't going to last. And these kinds of reforms that try to buy off the industry, well, remember, the industry will be bought off until it's no longer in their interest to be bought off. And then you'll see the insurance industry didn't defend the individual mandate. Did they? I didn't see any defense of it in December. And yet it was supposedly their condition for supporting the Affordable Care Act in 2010, 2009. That tells you right there the sophistry and the insecurity generated by incrementalist strategy that tries to buy off corporations when in fact they're just going to turn around and pursue their economic interest against ours.
Well, that's a fantastic point, actually, Michael Lighty. I had not really fixated on the fact that they didn't come out there swinging for it. They seemed to be perfectly willing to accept the loss of the individual mandate, which, by the way, just indulge me for a second, I predicted in 2007 would be politically unpopular, and I'm sure you did too, by the way. We didn't know each other then. But one of the consequences, every time I brought it up, it seemed I was being lectured by somebody saying, well, it's necessary to prevent adverse selection. No, I get the selection issues. It's not a question of selection issues. It's a fact that it's inherently regressive and unpopular. People don't like being mandated to buy a crappy product, which is what private sector healthcare insurance is. A product where, according to Milliman, actuarial firm, if you have quote-unquote good employer-based healthcare coverage, a family of four will still pay $10,000 out of pocket every year, $11,000, excuse me, now. So people don't like being forced to pay for a product like that. So, yes, of course, nobody wants to see the misery that would come from repeal, but it goes back to the point that your point and mine, that this is not a stable system, and it's one where you can't count on corporations to do your heavy lifting for you.
That's right, and RJ, I think you make the right point that the folks who argued for the individual mandate were simply wrong. It turns out we now have real-world experience, and what we know is that the reason people are buying health insurance under the Affordable Care Act is because they get a tax subsidy to do so. It's not the mandate, it's the tax subsidy. So if you distribute the tax subsidy, right, the adverse selection goes away, because whether you're in ill health or in good health, you'll take the subsidy and buy the insurance. That's what the actual implementation of the Affordable Care Act has shown. So here we are, back to first principles. You can either subsidize the purchase of private insurance and pay the 20 to 30% of overhead, have all those profits, the high executive salaries, the waste and inefficiency of fragmentation, or you can adopt a Medicare for All system where you're paying everyone directly, all the providers directly, and getting rid of the insurance companies, or you can go to National Health Service like the Veterans Administration and have everyone work for a government entity. But really, that's where we're at. And so I think the brush has been cleared, and the insecurities and fallacies of the neoliberal approach embodied in the Affordable Care Act outside of the Medicaid expansion is failing. Medicare is popular and works. Hey, why don't we try that?
Right, absolutely. And we can even phase it in as the Medicare for All bill does. So I think that's a perfect time. And again, we're talking with Michael Lighty, a director of public policy for National Nurses United. I think it's a perfect moment to segue to 2018. What do you see as the battles and opportunities? I probably shouldn't use the word battles so much because it kind of internalizes this historically democratic position of constantly defending what little change you've been able to make, as opposed to thinking big about the future. I should probably find a different word, but what do you see as the opportunities for 2018 going forward, and the work that might need to be done?
We have the first opportunity since 1992 and maybe prior to, but certainly since 92, to institutionalize Medicare for All as the fundamental demand of the Democratic Party for healthcare reform. And we haven't been there. We haven't been there in a long time, but we are on the verge of being there, because this issue, 70 to 80% of the Democrats support Medicare for All. It's a motivating issue for those voters. It is an issue that is cross-racial. It is an issue that motivates working class folks. And the reality is, right now, we're at a pivot point, because, as I mentioned earlier, those who get tax subsidies are going to buy insurance. And those tax subsidies even include workers who get employer insurance, because taxpayers pay $342 billion a year to subsidize the purchase of private insurance by employers for their workers. So that too is tax subsidized. But if you don't get a tax subsidy, if you're a middle-class person who maybe doesn't have a very good employer health plan, or you have to buy it yourself, you're the ones who are really getting screwed by the system. And so all of a sudden we realize this commonality of interest, and the healthcare disparities that African Americans and Latinos in particular experience, as well as Asian Americans, the lack of affordability for middle-class people, the evisceration of employer plans and the cost shift to workers, all of those interests are now converging around the demand. Enough. We got to have a solution, not just more of this incremental crap that doesn't solve the problem and just increases my costs, or just helps poor people but excludes me. All those kind of fissures and divisions can be overcome. And that's the opportunity we have with Medicare for All, as a signifier that, yes, our government can protect and empower people, it can provide for security, and it can address a fundamental need as a matter of right. And that really, I think 18 is going to be the pivot year where we finally see a coalescence of that around that position as the solution to our healthcare crisis.
So how do we advance that going forward? I completely agree with you. I think that's extremely well said. How do we, as individuals, as people who might have an opportunity to talk to others, as citizens, as voters, as whatever, how do we advance that agenda in 2018?
I think it's keeping up the drumbeat on social media. I think it's having an incredibly positive effect. I think it is making sure that every legislator that represents you at the city, county, state, or and federal level knows that your demand is for Medicare for All, that you expect every representative at every level to make that demand and to implement it on your behalf. And then I think we need to join those organizations if you're not already in one, or get active in one if you're a member that is organizing on these issues, because we need to make this the litmus test. Let's not be afraid of that. It's not a litmus test, it's a solution. So let's not be afraid of it. Let's interject it in every campaign this year. Never underestimate, this is all, we always say this, but never underestimate the impact of a letter to the editor or a handwritten letter to an elected official. Never underestimate that, particularly in this digital age. So all those things can coalesce, and if you're living in a state like California, demand that they move SB 562. It's criminal that the Assembly is sitting on that bill in the face of this healthcare crisis. Similarly, in New York, they can move it there. Every representative must be pressured, particularly if they're a Democrat, to demand Medicare for All. And that really is at all levels. I think the other issue, too, is that folks can engage on in social media. Post information on Facebook, on Twitter. Post your own experience. Tell your story. There's so many people who have healthcare stories, even if it's just a bill you couldn't pay. others need to know that. Let's start connecting with each other around a humane healthcare system that is informed by our own experiences and our own stories. And let's start telling those stories.
Well, I can't, for once, I can't top that. I think that's a perfect description. So we are going to leave it there. It's going to be, in my opinion, a great year. I mean, in terms of this struggle, obviously we have terrifying things on our shoulders, and there are going to be tragic consequences to what's going on in Washington and all of those things. But I think we are making real advances in the fight for single payer, Medicare for all, and I'm excited about it. Michael Lighty, Director of Public Policy for National Nurses United, thanks for fighting this fight, and thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure, RJ, and thanks for fighting with me.
My pleasure.